Before Shen Xian could speak, this cultivator started to recite, I am Zhuang Yonglai, originally from Jiaodong. Another wave of energy came out of Shen Xian's body and entered the cultivator's body. The cultivator instantly became motionless. It was as if even his emotions were frozen at this moment. You can leave. Shen Xian waved his hand at Ding Ning, indicating that Ding Ning could leave. Walking out of this stone room, Ding Ning saw Xue Wan was already waiting outside. At this time, Ding Ning felt a wave of sorrow, his eyes slightly dry. He knew that the deepest stone room was not far from here. He even knew the location of that stone room. However, the saddest thing was that he couldn't even look in that direction, couldn't even carefully sense what kind of arrangements there were. He couldn't even let the bitterness in his eyes show in the slightest. He could only think, at least as he had wished from the start. He finally entered this great floating water prison that had changed greatly. Following Xue Wan's footsteps, he thought coldly inside. In a situation where so many powerful formations had been perfectly preserved, there seemed to be only one way to quickly enter the innermost water prison. After entering the water prison, there seemed to be only one possibility to leave. 4 cultivators above Realm 7 had to work together. Thinking of the presence flowing out of Shen Xian's body, his gaze grew colder. He was certain that 4 was not enough. At least 5 Realm 7 cultivators were needed. But in all of Chongling, who would dare to enter here and defy the cultivators of the Qin dynasty? Ding Ning felt slightly cold. He shrunk his body slightly. Many of the flowers painted on the wall of the Wudong building had dimmed due to time. Many cultivators above Realm 7 were involved in this wall. But just like Liang Lian and Forefather Zhou, who he had just added, these people could kill each other in his plan, but how could they work together for him? Zhang Sun Qianxue was in front of the wall he had painted. She did not understand the meaning of Ding Ning's flower-like symbols. She was not willing to spend any brain power on matters other than cultivation. She only wanted to turn herself into a sword that would forget many things. It would become simpler and simpler, but also stronger and stronger. So while this wall had existed for a long time, this was the first time she stood here and looked seriously. Today, she had such a change because she had heard what Xue Wan had said to Ding Ning. She knew what kind of place the great floating water prison was. Entering a place like that, Ding Ning was likely to be trapped. She couldn't help but feel a little anxious. At this time, it was the first time that she truly saw the painting wall that Ding Ning had left behind. At first, she felt that it was extremely complicated, and it was extremely difficult for her to firmly remember so many grudges. But soon, her picturesque brows furrowed deeply, and an indescribable strange feeling rose in her heart. She could faintly see that the paths between the flowers were the paths of Chongling. One of the blue flowers was the location of the wine shop she was in right now. Some of the gray flowers were in the turrets that kept watch on the straight paths of Chongling. These positions were fixed, and there were many seemingly random and meaningless green leaves. In her eyes, they became the stationed and active tiger wolf army. Some of the intentionally empty places were best to avoid the turrets and the routes of the tiger wolf army. So this wall was also a map of how to escape Chongling as quickly as possible. Ding Ning had so easily drawn such a map with some hints. He definitely knew it by heart, so this map was for her to see. What made it even more difficult for her to understand was that all the pictures on the wall were actually a person's face. It was her face. While other than her, no one would be able to see it, but they had the same charm. But just like practicing the sword, it was not hard to refine the form, but the charm was hard. If there is no definite news of you before midnight, I will try to leave. Zhang Sun Qianxue took a deep breath and spoke coldly to the wall like she usually spoke to Ding Ning. However, At this moment, her beautiful face was suddenly covered with a layer of frost. She sensed a familiar aura. A carriage stopped outside a restaurant along the street. A carriage driver in thick cotton robes dozed off as he held a slightly hot copper soup. He was waiting for his employer in the restaurant. A light wind blew behind his head. This carriage driver felt his eyelids grow heavy. His head drooped, and he fell into a deep sleep. A gentle power came from the empty carriage behind him. It controlled the reins, turned the horse around, and slowly moved towards an alley outside Falling Parasol. This carriage silently followed a man dressed as a merchant passing through Falling Parasol. After following the carriage through several streets and alleys, the carriage lost control and stopped. The coachman, who was sleeping soundly, suddenly woke up. When he saw the surrounding scenery, he was sweating profusely. He repeatedly scolded himself for being too sleepy and causing the carriage to wander around several streets. Fortunately, he didn't bump into anyone. At this time, the carriage driver of the other carriage on the street also had his head drooped and fell into a deep sleep. At the same time, a gentle power came from the carriage and continued to control the carriage to follow the man. After passing through several more streets, the man dressed as a merchant stopped in his tracks. The restaurant in front of him had its doors closed. Yet Zhang Sun Qianxue, who was slowly releasing a gentle power from the carriage, sensed a gray-robed man washing some horse gear in the back courtyard of the restaurant. She knew that this gray-robed man was called Jing Maozong. He was one of Wang Taishu's most loyal subordinates, and someone who had fought with Ding Ning in the streets. At this time, she sensed the intentions of the man dressed as a merchant who gave off a familiar presence. After a moment of thought, she said coldly and softly, as though she was speaking to Ding Ning, "Apologies, the plan does not change." In the next moment, her presence shook slightly. The primordial qi controlling the reins became even more violent. The man standing in front of the restaurant suddenly turned around, and his gaze landed on the carriage she was in. Zhang Sun Qianxue's expression did not change. She controlled the carriage to continue forward. The man dressed like a merchant narrowed his eyes slightly. He gave off an indescribable coldness and rebelliousness. A slight, scornful smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. Without any hesitation, he quickened his steps and followed Zhang Sun Qianxue's carriage. At the same time, a patch of white cloud suddenly fell from the sky above. In the air, this patch of white cloud had completely turned into water, becoming a glowing and vast stream of water, like a serpent. Fan Zhuo's sword turned into a stream of water and slashed towards the carriage. The dragon-like stream of water in the sky also fell towards the carriage. At the same time, his body seemed to be pulled by the sword and flew towards the frozen river. His body was wrapped in thick water vapor. There seemed to be 3 streams of water dancing in the air. Fan Zhuo's face was vicious, but his eyes were cold and calm. While his cultivation was Realm 6 First Class, and he was still a step away from Realm 7, Cloud Water Palace's cultivation methods and fighting methods were not something ordinary cultivation sects could compare to. Also, the closer they were to water, the stronger the cultivators of Cloud Water Palace would be. While this river was frozen, he had a way to turn it into flowing water. Even if the other was a cultivator who surpassed Yi's ceiling, he was confident he could use this river to escape. Before the water arrived, a powerful force tore apart the carriage and sent the 2 large horses pulling the carriage flying. Zhang Sun Qianxue was among the fragments of the carriage. Her body seemed to be cut by the fragments. Yet, in the eyes of a cultivator of her level, the scene seemed to have stopped. A blue longsword appeared in her hand. The color of the longsword darkened rapidly, turning into a bluish-black color, forming a strong contrast with her jade-white skin. The bluish-black color was too deep, so when she held the sword, it was as if she was holding the world of the netherworld. In this moment, Fanjua, who was flying towards the frozen river, saw her face and the sword in her hand. Nine Hell King's sword. You are Gong's son, he finally reacted and cried out in shock. At this time, Zhang's son Qianxue attacked. All of the fragments of the carriage around her suddenly stopped in the air, turning into countless crystals wrapped in blue ice. Then in the next moment, they exploded into dust. The vast and enormous flow of water falling from the sky quickly froze when it was dozens of feet away from her, turning into blue crystals from head to tail. It stopped in the air and then crashed to the ground. Fanjua's life-bond sword gave off a shrill hum, but it could not stop the blue ice crystals from spreading on its surface. It was completely frozen when it was a few feet away from her, and was sent flying by Zhang's son Qianxue's power. Fanjua's vital energy surged out of his body like a great river and crashed below him. At this time, he was on the frozen river surface. His true essence was like countless waterfalls crashing onto the ice surface, causing a strange rhythm. The entire frozen river immediately thawed. The cold air was forcibly forced out of the water, forming countless threads of light that flew high into the sky and dispersed like fireworks. Boom, 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 boom. A string of terrifying explosions sounded around him. Enormous pillars of water shot up around him and formed multiple walls of water with him at the center. However, the river water beneath him did not dry up. It was as if the water in the distance had been attracted over in an instant. Instead, it formed a huge water whirlpool beneath him. His body was about to fall into it and use the water to escape. Crack, 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 crack. But at this time, Fanjua's breathing stopped. He seemed to hear the sound of death. Countless huge water pillars changed color, all of them turning into azure ice pillars. A blue-black sword light pierced through the center of one of the ice pillars and stabbed in front of him. Fanjua's face was bloodless. He screamed and used the fingers of his right hand as a sword. A terrifying sword essence stabbed out of his fingers in an attempt to fight for a sliver of time. But his right hand immediately lost all feeling and broke. A loud smack was heard. His body shot backwards and embedded into the ice pillar behind him. Such a powerful 9 Hell King's sword. I had not expected you to have such terrifying cultivation. But you cannot get anything from me. Bai Shanshui will take revenge for me. Fanjua's vital energy could not flow, but his face was covered in a vicious smile. When this voice sounded, a unique flow of water seemed to rush from his abdomen to the top of his head. Pew! A white stream of water gushed out of his mouth. This great rebel of Cloud Water Palace stopped breathing just like that. There was no more life in him. Chapter 149. The blue-black sword light disappeared. Zhang's son Qianxue's figure appeared in front of Fanjua. Looking at Fanjua, whose vital energy had been completely frozen, but who had still used an unknown secret art of Cloud Water Palace to kill himself, Zhang's son Qianxue did not have any pride on her face, but a hint of confusion and sadness. In the end, he was an enemy of the Yuanwu Emperor. Now, there was one less. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out her hand and released a few strands of aura to search Fanjua's body. She took out everything in Fanjua's clothes and put them into her sleeves without looking at them carefully. In the next moment, countless invisible but real paths seemed to appear in the world around her. Waves of icy energy were drawn out along these paths and quickly dissipated into the world. All the blue colors disappeared. The icicles collapsed and fell to the ground. Zhang's son Qianxue's brow furrowed deeply again. She knew that the distant turrets had sensed the abnormality here, and there should be cultivators hurrying over. But she was not skilled in many things, such as destroying corpses. She thought for a long time and then made a decision. A vast wave of primal energies of the universe came out of her body and turned the shattered ice piled up in the surroundings into fine ice powder. The wild wind spun on the river surface and filled all the holes with the ice powder. Her body landed in the center of the shattered carriage. The vital energy in her body should have been extremely cold, but as her face turned slightly red, she forcibly turned it into an incomparably hot flow. In the next moment, the burning vital energy gushed out with her body as the center and immediately ignited countless fire snakes. The fire serpents ignited all the shacks, and a large number of fire serpents coiled around Fanju's body, burning him to ashes in an instant. Then, they were blown away by the strong wind, drifting to an unknown place. Zhangsun Qianshue's body also disappeared under the cover of the raging flames. A few dozen breaths later, several black-robed cultivators arrived at the scene of the fire. When they sensed the remaining vibrating rhythms in the air, the expressions of these cultivators changed. The leading cultivator raised his hand, and a black pillar of smoke rushed into the sky. Changling was enormous, while Falling Parasol to the great floating water prison was not far on the map of Changling. Even on the shortest route, a familiar carriage would need more than half a day to travel. They had spent some time in the great floating water prison, so by the time they returned to Falling Parasol, the sky was already dark. Ding Ning closed his eyes as if he was tired, but in fact, he was thinking about all kinds of possibilities. At this time, the temporary village formed by the duck farmers on the bank of the Wei River's tributary had long disappeared and turned into a piece of scorched earth. Several dozen black-clothed officials of the Astrology Bureau stood like nails, surrounding this area. All of a sudden, a strange light flashed in the eyes of the dozens of black-clothed officials with solemn expressions. Several carriages entered their line of sight. They drove along the dirt path between the crisscrossing paths and stopped outside the forest. Even though there was no wind or rain, the 5 people who walked down from the carriages still opened their black umbrellas and covered their faces. A white-robed woman and an old man who looked like an old servant walked over, surrounded by these 5 black umbrellas. The white-robed woman was naturally the bureau chief of the Astrology Bureau, Yi Siling. The old man who looked like an old servant next to her was the legendary strongest of the 6 academicians of the Astrology Bureau, Han Sancher. The other 5 symbolic black umbrellas naturally represented the other 5 mysterious academicians of the Astrology Bureau. Yi Siling made a gesture from a distance. The dozens of Astrology Bureau officials who had sealed off this area immediately flashed out and distanced themselves from the sealed and monitored area. Yi Siling and Han Sancher slowly walked through the scorched earth. In the end, they stood where Zhangsun Qianshue's carriage had been destroyed. The 5 black umbrellas spread out and carefully sensed the presence left behind, searching every inch of the ground. This process continued for a long time. When the sky was completely dark, the academicians of the Astrology Bureau under the 5 black umbrellas finally exchanged opinions with Han Sancher. During this time, Yi Siling only calmly looked at the traces left by the fire and did not even listen to their conversation. Only when Han Sancher walked to her side did she look at him and say, "How is it?" Han Sancher said softly, "It is her." Yi Siling then asked, "The opponent is from Cloudwater Palace?" Han Sancher nodded slightly and said, "Should be." Yi Siling grew silent. Han Sancher also grew silent. "Remove all traces we can detect." Yi Siling's face started to fade into the darkness. His emotions could not be seen. His tone was low but unusually firm. "Do not record it. Do not inform the other bureaus." Han Sancher was the oldest academician of the Astrology Bureau and the only person Yi Siling had brought overseas. He naturally knew the meaning of Yi Sealing's words better than anyone else. His hands were slightly cold as he asked softly, "Even Chief Inspector Chen does not know?" Yi Sealing nodded and said, "No." In the darkness, Ding Ning walked back to the wine shop. Before this, he had already gone to Shui Wangshu's little courtyard and talked to Shui Wangshu, Zhang Yi, and Shun Yi about the great floating water prison. The moment he entered the wine shop and closed the door, Zhang Sun Qianshue's cold voice sounded in the darkness. "You are right, I am not skilled in many things." Ding Ning, who was very familiar with Zhang Sun Qianxue, immediately stopped breathing and asked, "What happened?" Zhang Sun Qianxue slowly said, "I killed that Cloud Water Palace cultivator. That person was very strong and should be Fan Zhua." Hearing the word kill, Ding Ning's body quickly turned cold. When he heard the complete sentence, he thought of how he had been considering if he could work together with Bai Shanshui to break the great floating water prison. He was so angry his body trembled. "Since you agreed to wait, why did you not wait?" Zhang Sun Qianxue was strangely not angry. She explained, "It is not that I do not have patience, but he wanted to kill Wang Taishu's subordinate. I did not want him to kill Wang Taishu's subordinate." Hearing this explanation, Ding Ning's anger quickly faded, but the coldness still caused him to tremble slightly. He took a deep breath and walked in front of Zhang Sun Qianxue. He asked, "What did you do after you killed Fan Zhua?" Zhang Sun Qianxue did not want to think of the scene back then. She said with a frown, "I did my best to remove the presence of the Nine Hell King's sword, and used the methods of the Zhao Tru Fire Palace to burn his corpse and the things around him." Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said, "What were your thoughts back then?" Zhang Sun Qianxue said, "Even if I could not completely conceal my presence, I could at least not let others detect who I killed." "Your thoughts are correct." Ding Ning calmed down and said slowly, "But Fan Zhua is not an ordinary cultivator. If you want to kill him, you have to show power close to Realm 7 second class. This kind of power cannot be completely removed. The Astrology Bureau and the Divinity Bureau can find it." Zhang Sun Qianxue bowed her head slightly and said coldly, "So I admit that I am not skilled in many things." Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said, "This matter cannot be blamed on you. Maybe we can use this matter to see a person's true attitude." Zhang Sun Qianxue asked in confusion, "Who?" Ding Ning looked at her and said, "Yi Sealing." Zhang Sun Qianshue's voice immediately turned cold. She said, "You think too much." Ding Ning did not argue. He shook his head and smiled bitterly. If he really thought too much, if Yi Sealing used Bai Shanshui's power and used Bai Shanshui's revenge, then he would not have waited until the Min Mountain Sword trial started. A person like Bai Shanshui viewed life as ants and would not have any misgivings. Who could hide a secret in front of such a person's mad killing? If he could not wait until the Min Mountain Sword trials, even if he could enter Chongling again, would he have the chance to enter Min Mountain Sword sect and obtain the heaven-replenishing divine art? Thinking of Shui Taishu, Ding Ning's expression grew even more bitter. In the thick darkness, the scorched riverside was like a ghost hell. On the surface of the frozen river, a stream of water suddenly gushed out without any sound. Bai Shanshui, who was wearing a white fox fur coat and had skin as fair as cream, rose from the center of the water flow. He was as handsome as a young master from a wealthy family, but his body exuded an indescribable arrogance. This great rebel of Cloud Water Palace, an existence that caused countless people in the world to tremble at the mention of his name. While he could clearly sense that there were still cultivators from the Qin dynasty in the distant forest, he did not care. He only needed a moment. A translucent teardrop fell from his eye and landed on the ice, but it disappeared without a sound. Numerous white water droplets slowly seeped out of the ice under his feet. Seeing these white water droplets, he was certain that the battle here had been caused by Fanjua, and that Fanjua had been killed. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. In the darkness, countless tiny droplets of water seeped out of the charred ashes and flew up. In his perception, there was a fire rising from the ground. A black bamboo had grown and swayed in the night mist. Chapter 150. In the tent at the center of the Tiger and Wolf Army camp, the light was dim, and only one oil lamp was lit. On the bed covered in ordinary blankets, Liang Lien sat with a wooden expression. Multiple strands of condensed primal energies of the universe floated around him like shields and gravestones. Suddenly, he sensed something. He opened his eyes and looked out of the tent. His gaze was cold and filled with wariness. Even for him, at this moment, he could feel a killing intent that caused his entire body to turn ice cold as it pierced through the air. With a whoosh, the tent flap was blown open by thick water vapor. Bai Shan-shui, dressed in white fox fur robes, appeared in the tent. The water vapor extinguished the oil lamp. Liang Lian's eyebrows rose slightly. Bai Shan-shui looked calmly at him and said, "Help me search for Realm 7 cultivators skilled in energy and ghosts." In the bedroom in the backyard of the Falling Parasol wine shop, an oil lamp was lit. Ding Ning spread out all the things that Zhangsun Qianxue had found on Fan Shua's body on his bed. At this time, he had recovered his calm. For people like Fan Shui, there was only the possibility of making a transaction. There was no possibility of extracting any useful information from their mouths. For Zhangsun Qianxue, who had been more pampered than a princess since childhood, and then left home to cultivate, and did not know much about the ways of the world, today's performance was very good. For him, there were countless possibilities in life. If he could not enter Min Mountain Sword Sect, he had two choices. The 9-death silkworm's cultivation dissipated, or he could find a solution from the lonely mountain sword horde. Fan Zhua had many things on him. Many of them were things that normal people would use. Clearly, he felt that he had no chance of dying. Ding Ning did not even let go of the most ordinary things like silver. He looked carefully before dismissing them. In the end, there were only 3 things left in front of him: a pearl, a yellowed sheepskin scroll, and a wooden tablet. The pearl was about the size of a longan fruit. It emitted a gentle glow in the dark night, as if there were waves of dense mist on its surface. However, the most peculiar thing was that this pearl was translucent. Its interior was as blue as the sea, and the light within seemed to faintly form some images. Ding Ning narrowed his eyes slightly. He saw that the image inside the pearl seemed to be a celestial island with countless beautiful palaces and spirit springs and spirit medicines. What is this? In the previous process, Zhangsun Qianxue had been waiting patiently. She finally asked, "This is a sea serpent pearl, a pearl formed from an enormous shellfish overseas." Ding Ning said, "Ever since the Qin dynasty opened up the sea route, they have found 3 such sea serpent pearls. The flow of some mines and underground rivers can help cultivators understand the flow of primal energies of the universe. Now, many of the landforms have changed. If one wants to understand the true flow of underground rivers, they have to use the previous water record scripture. If so, this means that Bai Shan-shui at least knows the way to solve the lonely mountain sword horde and has started to comprehend it." Zhangsun Qianshue's face immediately turned cold. Her thoughts were simple and direct. For her, the Yuanwu Emperor was an enemy, and so was Bai Shan-shui. The lonely mountain sword horde was likely to help her catch up to the Yuanwu Emperor's cultivation, so she had to take it. "Will it be soon?" she asked in a slightly cold voice. "Do not be impatient." Ding Ning glanced at her and said seriously, "It is true. Do not be impatient. I am not lying to you. I do not know how many years it will take for those below Realm 8 to comprehend and solve it. After a pause, Ding Ning said, Bai Shanshui wants to use the Lonely Mountain Sword Horde to help him reach Realm 8 quickly. But before Realm 8, it is very difficult to comprehend and solve the treasure trove of the Lonely Mountain Sword Horde. So, the order here is not right. Zhang Sun Qianxue thought about the meaning in Ding Ning's words and watched as Ding Ning picked up the last wooden sign. This wooden sign looked like it was made from red sandalwood. The color was so purple it was almost black, and there were many golden star-shaped spots on the surface. But the difference was that these golden star-shaped spots were especially bright, and there was some silver light in the gold. It looked like there was another small world inside. There were no characters on the wooden sign, just 3 human-shaped seal scripts. I know what this is. This time, she did not ask and said to Ding Ning, who was studying carefully, I have seen it before. Ding Ning stilled. He had never seen something like this before. He could not help but ask, What is this? Zhang Sun Qianxue said, This is a token of Celestial Seal Sect. Ding Ning's gaze jumped. Zhang Sun Qianxue glanced at him and said, My family once had contact with Celestial Seal Sect, but I had not expected the change to happen so quickly and was destroyed before I could use the power of Celestial Seal Sect. Other people might not understand the meaning in Zhang Sun Qianxue's words, but Ding Ning knew, just like how Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate were the strongest sects of the Qin dynasty, Celestial Seal Sect was the strongest sect of the Yan dynasty. In reality, Celestial Seal Sect was like the Bazan Kendo ground of the former Qin dynasty. Its foundation was deeper than Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate. On the surface, the Yan dynasty was at peace with the Qin dynasty, but Ding Ning knew that the Yan had worked hard to stop the rise of the Qin dynasty in these years. Forefather Zhou was like a worm that refused to die, struggling at death's door. The new Marquis Fong family was like the rising sun, shining brightly. In the eastern suburbs of Chongling, in a secluded courtyard in Fangho province, Fong Xiumu, his long hair loose like wild grass, and his clothes ragged like a beggar, was still sitting in front of the jade pool. The spring water that formed this jade pool was a hot spring that emitted slightly warm steam. There were multiple red carps swimming among the green grasses of the pool. Everyone, including the Fong family cultivators who walked into this secluded courtyard, thought that Fong Xiumu was comprehending sword essence by watching the fish. Yet no one expected that Fong Xiumu was watching life, old age, sickness, and death. The red carps were always taken care of by the female attendants in the courtyard, but there were not the few of them from a decade ago. Even though the spring water was clear, there were still countless unknown reasons that caused the fish to weaken and die. Other than these fish, he also saw many more minute details. He saw some tiny insects in the jade pool. The lifespan of an insect was even shorter than that of an insect's. For example, some mosquitoes in the summer only had a dozen days of life in their cycle. This kind of cycle naturally contained true meaning and the principles of energy creation and destruction. The cultivators of Chongling did not know Fong Xiumu's true cultivation. Based on some clues, they judged that he was Realm 6 First Class, and not Realm 7. At this time, only those of high status who were close to the monarch could infer from the emperor's decree that his cultivation was likely above Yi's ceiling and the others, and beyond Realm 7 Second Class. But the reality was that his cultivation was still Realm 6 First Class. What was even more shocking was that 10 years ago, he had already glimpsed the path to breaking through to the next realm. In other words, starting from 10 years ago, if he was willing, he could enter Realm 7 at any time. But he had deliberately stayed in front of the gates to Realm 7 for 10 years. How different would he be from the other Realm 7 cultivators after a breakthrough after 10 years of waiting and accumulation? Only he seemed to know this originally, but at this time he received an imperial decree. The Yuan Wu Emperor requested that he attend the Deer Mountain Conference with him. This meant that the Yuan Wu Emperor also knew. Su Xiumu did not know why the Yuan Wu Emperor also knew, but this broke his mental state. This decree was a request, but it was an order. The imperial decree wanted him to have a breakthrough. He wanted him to sharpen this sword that had been tempered for many years and create a new sky for the Qin dynasty. Other than this, maybe there was a deeper meaning in this imperial decree. The imperial decree could not be disobeyed. Only a breakthrough. Just a little bit more spring. Su Xiumu hesitated for many days. He understood the deeper meaning. He knew he could not wait any longer. At the beginning of spring, he sighed softly and pushed open the door. The presence of spring bloomed from his body. Countless flowers bloomed in the courtyard. Even the cold-fearing peonies bloomed to the brightest. In the morning, Ding Ning, who was holding a bowl of noodles and eating noodles with Shui Wangshu, Zhang Yi, and Shen Yi, was also waiting. But nothing seemed to have happened. Fan Zhua, who had died in the temporary village of the duck farmers, disappeared like an insignificant gangster in Changling. No one from the Astrology Bureau or the Divinity Bureau appeared around Falling Parasol. It seemed that no one in Changling even realized the death of this great rebel of Cloudwater Palace. Not waiting for anything to happen was good news for Ding Ning. His vital energy cultivation was growing steadily each day. The beginning of spring was here, and he was one step closer to the Min Mountain Sword trials in the middle of summer. However, he needed more time and things to be sure of what the high and mighty female bureau chief was thinking. In the cold spring, Su Qin carefully inspected his clothing. Then he used the cleanest white cloth to wrap around his left hand, so that his left hand would not look disgusting. Then he walked out of the establishment he had lived in for a long time and walked towards the carriage parked on the side of the street. The carriage was of Changling standard, but the streets were the streets of Chung City, the capital of the Chu dynasty. The Chu king liked beautiful wastes. Looking out, the countless buildings of Chung City were hidden in the greenery like beautiful women. The scenery was exquisite and beautiful. At this time, Su Qin's gaze landed on a begonia by the side of the road. This begonia was in full bloom, its flowers like rouge. Su Qin showed a hint of a smile. He had waited for a long time in this beautiful Chu capital that was completely different from Changling. Today, he finally received an audience with the most powerful woman of the Chu dynasty. The carriage carried him through the streets and alleys of the Chu capital. Countless branches of the weeping willows gently swayed on the carriage. Many vigilant and emotional gazes watched as this carriage drove into a temporary residence. There was a beautiful bead curtain hanging in the main hall of this palace. Behind the curtain, one could faintly see the legendary woman. As a Qin person, you have come to the Chu to lobby. You have 15 minutes. If you cannot persuade me in this time, it means you and Li Lingjun are failures. I will kill you, and he will not qualify to return here. The woman's voice was soft, but at the same time, there was sharpness stabbing into Su Qin's ears, causing great pain in his eardrums. But his expression was still calm. He bowed his head and said, "I do not need 15 minutes. I only need to say one thing." Behind the bead curtain, there was silence, waiting for him to speak. Su Qin said, "If you allow him to return here, you are the Empress. You know, the Empress has two meanings. You can have both." Impudence. A shout sounded behind the bead curtain. Because it was too cold and intense, the voice echoed in the hall like countless people were angrily scolding Su Qin for being impudent. The Empress had two meanings. One was Mother Empress, the other was Empress. She could have both. She could have both identities at the same time. But to have both identities at the same time, how rebellious was this? The woman behind the bead curtain naturally knew what Su Qin's words meant, so she scolded him so fiercely. But Su Qin's expression did not change. He bowed deeply and said calmly, "But this is the greatest promise Li Lingjun can give. You should also know that if you let him ascend the throne and he gives you both identities, your status here will be even more stable and your relationship with him will be even more stable." The woman behind the bead curtain looked at him but did not speak. Su Qin looked at the ground. He knew that he had not died yet and would not die today. So he said softly with emotion and satisfaction, "You know very well that some people have a lot of time to wait, but some people, some matters cannot wait. Those who hear such impudent words deserve to die." The woman behind the bead curtain finally spoke. A sweet yet extremely terrifying killing intent burst out in the hall. The bead curtain shattered. Blood splattered all over the ground in the hall. The palace attendants on the two sides immediately died. Thousands of beads of various sizes fell on Su Qin's body and the ground around him, bouncing and giving off pleasing sounds. Su Qin did not die. He bent even lower and said in a blessing, "You will be the most noble mistress of the Chu dynasty now and in the future." Chapter 152. After the beginning of spring, all the cultivation sects in Chongling were closed. A youth dressed in red robes with a white fox collar floated over a high wall of a cultivation place in Chongling and snuck out. A light cough sounded not far away. This youth dressed in red robes with a white fox collar immediately froze. He did not have the terror that ordinary sect disciples would have when they were discovered escaping, but had a slightly embarrassed and angry expression. At this time, a soft voice sounded. "Cousin, Anne is right. You do not work hard on your cultivation, usually." Hearing this, the youth's embarrassment and anger disappeared, and his face filled with joy. He suddenly turned around and said in disbelief to the person who had spoken, "Cousin, why have you come?" Standing nearby was a youth of similar age to him. Even though he had a teasing smile, he still appeared exceptionally kind and gentle. This was the imperial son Fu Su, who was the favorite of the Qin dynasty's empress and emperor. The Qin dynasty's empress Zheng Xiu only had one cousin, Zheng Fei, who had married into the Meng marquisate establishment. This youth dressed in red robes, with a white fox collar called Fu Su cousin. He was naturally the heir of the Meng marquisate establishment, Meng Qihai. Looking at the overjoyed Meng Qihai, Fu Su was also happy. He smiled and said, "Mother Empress allowed me to travel outside and gain experience. I am not familiar with the outside world, so the first person I thought of was you. I heard that you are a top student of the Fish Sun Sword School, who does not know your place and often jumps over the wall. I wanted to come to these high walls and imagine how you would look when you jumped over the wall. I had not expected you to jump in front of me like this." Meng Qihai did not have many chances to meet Fu Su in a year, but the two had played together since childhood. Fu Su was easygoing and often let him do as he wished. Even when children had conflicts, he would let him have his way. Therefore, he and Fu Su were very close. Usually, he would just call Fu Su cousin. In his joy, he jumped in front of Fu Su and grasped Fu Su's hands. He said, "Cousin, you came at the right time. I am the one who is thinking." Fu Su was slightly taken aback. "What do you mean?" Meng Qihai said happily, "Cousin, you cultivate the fastest of all the young talents in Chongling. It should not be a problem for you to deal with the people on the talent ranking. You came at the right time. Help me teach someone a lesson." Fu Su looked at him curiously and asked, teach you a lesson. What is going on?" The White Goat Cave wine shop youth, who was in the limelight a few days ago. Meng Qihai twisted his lips and said, "A few days ago, Zhen Tingan and I heard extremely unfavorable news for him. Out of kindness, we went to find him. We thought that if he performed well, I would tell him the news. I remember clearly that he broke two of Duanmu Jingzong's ribs over a minor matter. So the Li Marquisate establishment had no choice but to send him to the Yuezhi country." Meng Qihai sneered and said, "He stayed in the Yuezhi country for so many years and ate so much sand. I think he does not have a good temper. Falling Parasol is not the Duanmu Marquisate establishment. If he wants to act, it will not be as simple as breaking two ribs." Fu Su's brow furrowed deeply. Back when Ding Ning reached profound understanding in half a day and had a breakthrough in a month, he had developed great curiosity about this wine shop youth, while he had heard the lessons of the Empress and his teachers, and knew that he should not spend time on these low-level cultivators. Ding Ning's performance after the Book of Talents was announced still attracted his attention. He had no thoughts about Ding Ning when he left the palace this time, but he had not expected to hear such a matter. This has nothing to do with the wine shop youth. Also, an outstanding cultivator like him is a valuable asset of the Qin dynasty. He unconsciously used the tone the Empress used to speak softly. Meng Qihai heard his meaning and twisted his lips. He said, "Cousin, if you do not help me teach him a lesson, do you want to interfere in this matter and help him?" Fu Su glanced at him and asked in response, "If Li Shixing's personality has not changed after so many years, and he has become even worse after going to a chaotic place like the Yuezhi country, who do you hate more compared to this wine shop youth?" Meng Qihai stilled and said to himself, "If we are comparing these two, of course it is Li Shixing." Fu Su looked at him and smiled slightly. Meng Qihai shouted in slight depression, "Cousin, in terms of reasoning, I can't win against you." Fu Su smiled, and then said seriously, "If other people are present, remember not to call me cousin. Otherwise, other people may immediately discover my identity. I do not want to cause trouble." Meng Qihai immediately felt that this was a very important matter. He immediately nodded and said, "I remember." Fu Su said with a smile, "Then you will take me to see that wine shop?" Meng Qihai was impatient and immediately nodded. He said, "All right, it will save Li Shixing from coincidentally going." Falling Parasol did not seem to be any different than usual. In the morning, when the families woke up to wash and eat breakfast, it was Falling Parasol's busiest time. After this time, Falling Parasol would quickly become quiet. There were few people on the streets, and there were few customers in the ordinary shops. Business could barely keep up with life. Yet, Zhang Sun Qianxue was the first to feel the abnormality. Thinking of the possibilities Ding Ning spoke of, her body quickly turned cold. However, when she sensed the cultivation of those people, she slowly relaxed. These people should not have come for the 9 Hell King sword because the difference in power was too great. They could not keep her and Ding Ning here. She called out. When Ding Ning walked into the inner courtyard, she said coldly and told Ding Ning what she sensed. Many cultivators had appeared near Falling Parasol, and they were not cultivators strong enough to keep a Realm 7 cultivator here. Ding Ning's brow furrowed deeply. He could not think of a reason. When he walked out of the wine shop again and headed towards Shui Wangshu's little courtyard, the countless little silkworms in his body seemed to awaken from hibernation and silently moved. His perception immediately grew several times clearer. He sensed the positions of some of the cultivators. Then he quickly found that many cultivators were moving with 2 cultivators. The 2 cultivators heading towards Falling Parasol were at the center of the encirclement formed by the cultivators. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed slightly. He could vaguely see that there was a strange reflection in the eaves not far away. This was the cold reflection of metal smeared with large amounts of oil. This kind of reflection would only appear on some crossbows and crossbows. So, this was an assassination. Chapter 153. The sound of the carriage wheels rolling on the stone path sounded. Ding Ning's expression grew colder. In just a few breaths of time, he had already thought through many links. The people in this carriage could only have come to Falling Parasol because of him. But what was their identity that they would attract so many cultivators to assassinate them? Even more importantly, someone who could launch an assassination on such a scale would know that he, Zhang Yi, and the others were in this alley. Falling Parasol was in a remote area between the south and east of the city. The nearest turret would not be able to detect the activity here. If they wanted to assassinate the people in the carriage, they did not need to wait until they reached Falling Parasol. The more cultivators there were in an area, the more unknown factors there were. Therefore, there was only one possibility. The leader who planned this assassination must have taken him, Zhang Yi, and the others into consideration. Simply put, this person wanted to kill the people in the carriage and them in Falling Parasol in one go. Speed was important in war. Success and failure were often just a few minutes apart. In the eyes of everyone in Changling, Ding Ning was just a low-level cultivator with some fame, but not enough wings. Yet he possessed unimaginable experience. Right now, without knowing who exactly was inside this carriage, he directly released a fierce shout with exceptional resolution. "There are assassins!" At the same time he shouted, there was a rapid roar in the quiet air, as if someone had poured a bucket of water down from the second floor. Ding Ning's pupils contracted slightly. From this sound, he knew this was the long-wind armor-piercing crossbow. The long-wind armor-piercing crossbow was an imitation of the Chu dynasty's Chu-wind heavy crossbow. While the seal scripts on the crossbow were not as fine as the Chu dynasty's crossbow, and the bolts that could be used were 20% lighter than the Chu-wind heavy crossbow, they were slightly faster and had enough penetrative power to break through the defenses of Realm 5 cultivators. This kind of armor-piercing crossbow was an important weapon in the warden's treasury. In the armies that went on expeditions, every 100 soldiers were equipped with one. This kind of standard heavy weapon would be recorded in the records. To be able to appear in an assassination in the marketplace, it could only mean that the assassin was not an ordinary person. The person in the carriage right now was also not an ordinary person. The moment the extremely oppressive sound wave rang out, the cold metallic reflection finally revealed its true appearance. The roof of that area could not withstand the vibrations of the crossbow and directly shattered and collapsed. A heavy black crossbow slid down in the shadow of the roof. At the same time, a crossbow arrow that weighed over 50 kilograms and had 4 metal fins spun violently in the air. Like lightning, it struck the carriage that had just turned into the alley. Clang! The heavy crossbow bolt struck the carriage, but the scene of the carriage being easily torn apart like a piece of paper did not appear. The entire carriage gave off a muffled metallic sound. The wood on the surface splintered and sputtered, revealing a silver-white membrane inside. This layer of silvery-white metal membrane looked extremely thin, which was why this carriage didn't look any different from an ordinary carriage. However, this thin layer of metal actually possessed astonishing toughness. This crossbow arrow that could even pierce through heavy armor actually couldn't penetrate it, only smashing against the surface. The powerful impact force forcibly sent the entire carriage flying outwards. With a boom, this carriage crashed into the wall of the noodle shop that Ding Ning and the others often ate at. Half of the wall collapsed, and it continued to slide inside, bringing with it countless bricks to crash into the smoking stove. "Junior Sect Brother, what happened?" Zhang Yi had just come out of the courtyard door behind Ding Ning. When he saw such a terrifying scene that he had never seen before, he immediately exclaimed in shock, "An assassination! I'm afraid it includes us. You and Junior Sect Brother Shun Yi protect Cave Master. Don't come out." Ding Ning knew that Zhang Yi was easily wishy-washy, so at the same time that he said these words as quickly as possible, he shouted, "Don't worry about me. I can handle it." Being shouted at by Ding Ning, Zhang Yi reflexively turned around and rushed back, almost colliding with Shen Yi, who had rushed out. At this time, in the cold air that had yet to rest, another sharp howl sounded. Zhang Yi had become more and more convinced of Ding Ning during this period of time. Yet when he heard this sharp howl and turned his head to look, he gritted his teeth and shouted at Shen Yi, "Go hide, Cave Master." At the same time, he resolutely rushed back towards Ding Ning, because it was a light green sword light that let out that sharp howl. This light green sword light was still on the distant eaves a moment ago, but in the next moment, it was already above the alley. The sharp whistling sound from the distance was now like a thunderous roar. The chi of heaven and earth behind the sword light was dragged into a perfectly straight line, looking like wisps of white smoke in the air. This was undoubtedly a flying sword that only Realm 5 cultivators could use. Also, from the distance, this sword flew. This cultivator had been immersed in flying sword arts for many years. He was not a cultivator who had just entered Realm 5, and his mental power was much stronger than ordinary people. Zhang Yi did not consider whether he was a match for this flying sword. A white sword light rose up like a white goat's horn. With a pop, the thickest part of the white goat's horn coincidentally stopped this flying sword. The flying sword cut through, cutting through the horn-like sword energy, and continued to slash towards Ding Ning's body. Yet Ding Ning's last flower sword did not stop moving. The remnant sword's tip accurately hit the flying sword. With a shout, this flying sword that had lost much of its power and had not been able to channel more power into it was pushed over Ding Ning's head. Countless lines of rain fell on the yellow-robed youth. The yellow-robed youth had used up all of his vital energy and was powerless to stop it. Pew, 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 pew. His clothing was torn, and his body was covered in tiny bloody holes. He could no longer stand and fell to the ground like a pile of rotten flesh. Such a scene appearing at the same time was a shocking and unexpected performance of the two youths from Falling Parasol. Qiu Zixing almost shouted in joy. Yet at this time, a strange color silently floated out of the ditch under the eaves next to Ding Ning. It was that gray-black flying sword. Ding Ning had just used all his strength to block the attack of another flying sword, and now this flying sword was here. How could he block it? Seeing this wine shop youth, who had just saved him, was about to die, Qiu Zixing's joyful shout immediately turned into a furious roar. His body began to tremble violently in an instant. Countless layers of power collided like a sword and a scabbard were rubbing against each other. Blood dripped out of his mouth and nose. Yet this invisible energy rope that the yellow-robed youth had created at the cost of his life was extremely strong. Even so, it only gave off faint cracking sounds and did not immediately collapse. At this time, Ding Ning's eyes were unusually calm. The remnant sword in his right hand was still moving upwards, but his left hand was pointing at the gray-black flying sword. Pew! Following that, there was another desolate shattering sound. The small cold sword that flew out from his fingertips once again struck the flying sword and sent it flying once more. Chapter 155. The small silver sword that Ding Ning had flicked over his head gave off a loud hiss, representing its master's anger. The sword of a Realm 5 cultivator had been stopped by a youth like this. Also, this youth had not died even after being attacked by another flying sword. For the master of this flying sword, this was a great humiliation. Yet, when cultivators fought, life and death were just a hair's breadth away. As the small silver sword gave off a loud hiss in the air, drawing a beautiful arc in the air and falling towards Ding Ning like a meteor, countless explosions sounded around Qiu Zixing. The dozen invisible ropes that the yellow-robed youth had used his life as the price finally broke apart. Pieces of the invisible rope fell to the ground around Qiu Zixing like heavy iron chains. Every piece of the rope fell to the ground, creating a huge wave of air around Qiu Zixing's body. It was as if waves were blooming. Once he lost the bindings of these energy ropes, the power in his body was finally freed. Qiu Zixing's gaze landed on the small silver sword flying towards Ding Ning. His hands slapped towards the depths of the noodle shop behind him. The two unparalleled sword qis intersected, forming a complete, transparent sword that pierced out with extreme determination. In the next moment, the backyard of the noodle shop exploded like a sheepskin raft that had been filled with too much air. Countless fragments flew backwards. Then, the many courtyards and walls behind the noodle shop were pierced through by this large sword. Waves of dust bloomed, forming a straight path that pointed towards a middle-aged cultivator standing in front of a well in a small courtyard. The middle-aged cultivator's anger immediately turned to terror. He knew he could not react in time and could only close his eyes in despair. Crack! The bones in his chest and abdomen were all shattered. His entire body was almost split in two by this sword. His body fell backwards and fell into the well behind him. This cultivator's silver-white flying sword was less than 10 feet from Ding Ning, but the thin silver-white small sword lost control at this time, flying over Ding Ning's head and falling into the ditch by the road. Qiu Zixing did not care about the flying sword flying toward Ding Ning. Instead, he killed the owner of the flying sword with one strike, completely solving the problem. However, there was no joy in Ding Ning's eyes. At this moment, the outcome of the battle between the two flying swords on the eaves had already been decided. In the end, the snow-white flying sword that flew out of the carriage was far inferior to the light green flying sword in terms of strength. Finally, it was unable to continue and was sent flying by the sword, bouncing towards a distant roof. The light green flying sword danced in the air happily, circling around the half-collapsed noodle shop, waiting for an opportunity. Two black sword lights charged out of Ding Ning's fingertips. Almost at the same time, they accurately hit the grayish-black flying sword that had just floated up from the ground. With a muffled sound, the little sword that had been raised like a poisonous snake hiding in the dried leaves fell to the ground, leaving behind multiple marks on the stone ground. Zhang Yi's eyes widened. He was pleasantly surprised, but his body quickly sank into coldness. This grayish-black little sword shot up violently towards Ding Ning again. As more power bloomed, black energy shrouded the grayish-black little sword like countless little ghosts were about to surge out. Using this opportunity, Ding Ning finally sensed the extremely weak path in the air and sensed the true location of this cultivator from the fly pond. The cultivator from the fly pond turned out to be a beggar who was huddling under a shabby house 2 blocks away at such a distance. Ding Ning was certain that even if Qiu Zixing discovered his existence, he would not be able to kill him in a short time. As for himself, he could not pass through 2 streets to reach the other. The chill in his heart grew stronger, but his emotions were still extremely calm. 3 streaks of black sword light shot out from the fingertips of his left hand, one after another, accurately striking the small grayish-black sword. The grayish-black little sword defeated 2 of his sword lights. When it defeated the 3rd sword light, it finally slowed down. Ding Ning's last flower longsword in his right hand swung out and hit the grayish-black little sword hard. This grayish-black little sword was once again thrown out and bounced away. A thunderous roar rang out at this moment. Qiu Zixing's hands moved together again, but unlike before, his hands swept rapidly through the air. Dozens of crisscrossing lights lit up. These lights did not seem like sword lights, but blade lights. His arms were like blades, guiding the primal energies of the universe as they crisscrossed in the air. The light green flying sword didn't expect him to have such a method, and was forced into a narrow space by the violent saber light. With a bang, a saber light finally caught the sword's trace, and viciously chopped down on the light green small sword. A loud, muffled grunt came from the distant alley. The light green little sword struggled out of the blade net. This attack had clearly caused great damage to the master of the little sword, but the master of the little sword knew the present situation and still managed to hold on. After the light green little sword retreated more than 100 feet, it started to speed up again and formed countless twisted sword shadows in the air. In a small courtyard not far from Ding Ning and Zhang, Shui Wangshu was sitting on a rattan chair in the bedroom. Since the battle started, he had only frowned and silently hid in this dimly lit room. At this time, Shun Yi closed the door and stood nervously next to him. Hearing the sounds of each attack outside, and sensing Ding Ning's performance, his expression grew more nervous, but his eyes grew brighter. 5 feet behind you, slash. At this time, he suddenly shouted at Shun Yi. Shun Yi's mind was tense to its limit, his hands covered in fine sweat. He did not feel anything, but Shui Wangshu's shout contained an irresistible command. He instinctively turned and attacked. There was a loud explosion. A bolt of lightning landed 5 feet behind him. There was a window 5 feet behind him. Just as the lightning from his sword landed, a dot of grayish-black light came through the crack in the window. The grayish-black little sword that Ding Ning had just blocked was silently sneaking over. There was a hiss. The grayish-black little sword froze and was burned by the lightning. Wisps of blue smoke rose from the blade, and the blade seemed to twist in pain. However, Chun Yi's breathing had completely stopped. Even he could feel that this sword strike was accumulating momentum and was about to burst out again. Shui Wangshu shouted. His breathing was irregular and he was about to cough, but he forced himself to endure. His face was red as he shouted again, painting remnant scroll sword essence, slash. Shun Yi's vital energy almost instinctively surged out of his body with this shout. The runes on the longsword in his hands suddenly surged with endless black light, as if a giant ink ball was going to devour the entire room. However, in front of his sword tip, countless pure and dazzling threads of light suddenly shot out. A bright beam of light hit the grayish-black little sword. The entire room seemed to contain a pure sun and lit up. Pure and blinding light came out of all the cracks. Chapter 156. Ding Ning suddenly turned around. He once again confirmed the thoughts of this fly pond cultivator. The target of this fly pond cultivator was all the young people on this street. In a situation where it was difficult to kill him in a short time, this fly pond cultivator did not have any obsession, but wanted to instantly kill Qin Yi, who was the easiest to kill in his eyes. But this fly pond cultivator ignored Shui Wangshu's existence. He ignored the fact that even though Shui Wangshu was weaker than an ordinary old person, he was a great cultivator above Realm 7. The gray-black sword at this time was a silent assassination sword intent, so it didn't carry much power. So when it was hit by Chun Yi's sword, it was immediately sent flying out of the window. The grayish-black blade was particularly eye-catching in the pure, dazzling light. These dazzling and pure rays of light seemed to have a natural suppressive effect on the energy flowing on the small gray-black sword. At this time, the small gray-black sword sizzled like black oil was melting, and wisps of green smoke were constantly coming out of it. From the start, Ding Ning felt that these death soldiers would not spare any cultivator in this alley, other than Zhang Sun Qianxue, whom they did not know. So he did not conceal his strength at all, and played an important role at the crucial moment to attract the attention of these cultivators. But this fly pond cultivator's cultivation and intelligence far exceeded his expectations, and still did things beyond his control. Assassins always had more initiative than those who defended passively, but this fly pond cultivator miscalculated again, giving him a chance to completely turn the situation around. He suddenly turned around, and a black light seeped out of the fingertips of his left hand. Everyone thought that he would attack the grayish-black sword that was particularly conspicuous in the bright light. Even the grayish-black flying sword had a trace of fear, and as if it had a life of its own, it once again pulled itself together and flashed upwards. However, what everyone did not expect was that after a series of sounds that made one's scalp turn numb, one after another, black-colored sword light shot out with a flip of his hand. All of them shot toward the small light green sword that had countless shadows lingering around it. The light green sword only wanted to trap Qiu Zixing to the side of the carriage. The sword shadows flickered. Even Qiu Zixing could not accurately grasp which sword shadow the true sword was in, and did not dare to attack. At this time, Ding Ning's back was facing the light green sword, and he could not accurately hit it. However, the dozen or so black sword lights that were shot out in succession were shockingly cold. They pierced through countless light green afterimages and immediately forced out the true body of the light green sword. Qiu Zixing's eyes seemed to burn. The cultivator in the distance screamed, sensing the greatest danger. The light green small sword trembled so much it seemed like it was about to explode. But it was too late. Qiu Zixing's fists punched again. The two terrifying translucent sword qi fused into a large sword once more. It instantly pierced out over 30 meters and heavily struck the light green sword. The light green sword seemed to wail in despair. It immediately lost power and spun out like a piece of scrap metal, falling to an unknown place. The small grayish-black sword that had been deceived became enraged. The black qi on the sword wildly surged and actually formed dozens of black, fly-like objects around the sword. They also descended in a straight line towards Ding Ning. Ding Ning's expression grew grave. A sword seal formed in front of him. A large river faced the gray-black sword. The power of his sword was far from the power that the fly pond cultivator had displayed. The river was directly penetrated. However, he was only fighting for a moment to slow down the speed of this small gray-black sword that was already flowing with an aura of despair. This was to ensure that his next cold small sword could hit its target. There was a soft hiss. Blood seeped out of his fingertips. The crystal-like cold energy formed a small black sword and accurately hit the tip of the gray-black sword. The small black sword immediately shattered into countless black pieces, spreading into layers of cold fiendish energy. The extremely gloomy grayish-black sword was like a small boat in a torrent, but it was suddenly hit by a head-on wave and paused in midair. With this pause, the remaining 5 cold swords in Ding Ning's body shot out and hit the gray-black flying sword one after another. The body of the flying sword was slightly bent unwillingly and was pushed back a few feet by the impact. Ding Ning took a deep breath. He had used up all his power and could not stop any of the gray-black flying sword's attacks. Now, he could only rely on Qiu Zixing. When the gray-black flying sword had turned violent, Qiu Zixing's eyes were filled with nervousness and worry. But when Ding Ning's first cold sword hit the gray-black flying sword, his body relaxed. He knew the situation was set. The more relaxed he was, the more his vital energy flowed. The comfort he felt could not be described with words. He laughed wildly. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the carriage. The ground under his feet exploded. He pulled the carriage with one hand and flew into the air, landing in the middle of the street. The wild wind blew, and half of the noodle shop collapsed behind him. The gray-black flying sword paused slightly in the air and did not fly towards anyone. 2 streets away, the owner of the grayish-black flying sword, a man in ragged clothes who looked like a beggar, shook his head and flew up. With just 2 leaps, he crossed 2 streets and appeared in front of the collapsed noodle shop. This was a man in his 40s. His face was covered in black oil, and his features were ordinary. He did not leave any impression, but at this time his hands were flowing with energy like black flames. He looked at Ding Ning with a bitter gaze and sighed emotionally. "How can you be so calm?" Before anyone could say anything, a crashing sound was heard as the courtyard wall of a shop was smashed down by someone. A long-bearded cultivator in indigo robes struggled out of the hole. He held an empty white jade scabbard in his hand. He looked to be in his 30s and had an elegant bearing. However, right now, beads of blood continuously seeped out from his skin. When he just walked out from the hole in the courtyard wall, his clothes still looked clean, but after just 3 steps, his green clothes were already soaked in blood, turning into a blood-red robe. What kind of sword art is that? This cultivator blinked to stop the blood from falling into his eyes, so he could see Ding Ning's face clearly. This cultivator was the owner of the light green sword. He had fought with Qiu Zixing for a long time without regard for his injuries. Adding on that Qiu Zixing had destroyed his flying sword with his last attack, his wounds were grave. At this time, everyone could sense that he had forced himself to appear here because he wanted to see Ding Ning before he died. Even sword attendants, who have been trained for a long time and specialize in cutting flying swords, cannot be as accurate as you. I originally thought that we could rewrite the history books, but I had miscalculated you. This cultivator looked regretfully and with a hint of admiration at Ding Ning. After saying this, he could no longer support himself and fell to the ground. The scene sank into silence. Everyone could understand his and the fly pond cultivator's emotions right now. Even if other people had the same star fiendish energy method as Ding Ning and could create black sword lights like that, who could be so calm in such a situation when facing the pressure of the flying sword? If there was a hint of panic and emotion, if the attack missed, the entire battle situation could be changed. But Ding Ning had not made a mistake. This was what shocked him and the fly pond cultivator the most. Chongling really is the place where true dragons are born. Generation after generation, there are many stunning children. I just wanted to eliminate a few of them, but I still underestimated them. The beggar-like fly pond cultivator sighed deeply. It is about time. He sensed the presence in the surrounding air and bowed to Qiu Zixing. He said, "This last attack, I want to see Mr. Qiu's Lingshu sword gates, peerless sword." Qiu Zixing understood the fly pond cultivator's meaning. His expression grew solemn. In the next moment, his vital energy surged out of his body, but primal energies of the universe surged in and gathered in his right hand. His right hand had turned bronze. The qi and blood in his body seemed to be burning, and every inch of his flesh and blood was bursting with terrifying power. With just one step, he came in front of the fly pond cultivator. His right hand was a sword and stabbed at the other's chest. This fly pond cultivator sensed a fierce sword essence he had never encountered before. A hint of gratefulness flashed through his eyes. The gray-black sword landed in his hand. As the sword swung upwards, black energy condensed into particles that flew out like a fountain and smashed into Qiu Zixing's body. In the next moment, the black spring in front of him was completely destroyed by Qiu Zixing's sword. This fly pond cultivator's body exploded like a ripe watermelon, spraying out waves of blood in the streets. Zhang Yi had an unbearable expression and felt like vomiting. Ding Ning did not like the smell of blood and held his breath. But he knew that dying with dignity in battle was the best outcome for this fly pond cultivator. Qiu Zixing pulled back his hand. Waves of great exhaustion started to sweep through his body. He took a deep breath. He knew he could not defeat any Realm 5 cultivator. He turned around and saw the indigo-robed cultivator on the ground had died with his head bowed. The blood dripping out of his nose and mouth had clearly turned black due to the poison he had taken. Sensing the flowing presences, he knew this place was absolutely safe. But what he found unusual was that, theoretically, there should be Realm 7 cultivators arriving by now. Changling was a square, and the streets were divided like tofu. While outsiders might not know, he knew that the two high ministers would make arrangements to ensure that there was a Realm 7 cultivator in charge of many of the squares. Even when Bai Shanshui had been fighting and singing that day, Yi Xiling had been just a step away from arriving. But today, there was such an important person in the carriage, someone who could change the course of history. Also, the battle had been fierce for a long time. Why had no Realm 7 cultivators appeared on this side? Chapter 157. But he did not need to worry about the matters of those important people. Qiu Zixing asked the people in the carriage in a soft voice, and then turned to look at Ding Ning. In today's assassination, the enemy had sent out a powerful seal master, 3 skilled swordsmen, and even a cultivator from the fly pond. In the end, the 3 youths from White Goat Cave would decide the result, especially Ding Ning's performance. If not for Ding Ning's incredible performance, he would have been killed immediately like his colleagues who had not appeared. When the Realm 7 cultivators arrived, the result would have been decided. Your performance today can only be described as perfect. Anyone who is your teacher will feel proud of you. Qiu Zixing said solemnly to Ding Ning, and then bowed towards the little courtyard where Shui Wangxu was. He was a cultivator who had left the Lingshu Sword Gate in the 3rd year of Yuanwu. In terms of status and experience, he was an elder to Ding Ning, so he gave such an evaluation of Ding Ning in his first sentence. His following words were to express the most sincere respect to White Goat Cave and Shui Wangxu, who could teach such a disciple. I owe you my life. Then he said seriously to Ding Ning in a soft voice. This was his personal gratitude, and it was completely from his personal standpoint. You do not owe me. Ding Ning looked calmly at Qiu Zixing and the numerous cultivators in casual clothing who had entered the alley. These cultivators were definitely stronger than the people of the Astrology Bureau and Divinity Bureau. Also, they did not come close to Qiu Zixing and the carriage. From this, he could guess the identities of the people in the carriage. While I do not know what is going on with these people, they clearly want to kill us. Ding Ning shook his head and continued, if it weren't for an expert like you, we would all have died here. Qiu Zixing smiled slightly and did not argue with Ding Ning. He only said, maybe I can recommend you to enter the Lingshu Sword Gate to study. Hearing this, Zhang Yi and Shen Yi shook, but Ding Ning shook his head again and said, I have decided to attend the Min Mountain Sword trials. Qiu Zixing stilled slightly, but then smiled and nodded approvingly. Cultivation must first follow your heart. Since Min Mountain Sword Sect is your first choice, entering Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate will be beneficial to your future cultivation. After a pause, he shook his head and said, I thought too much. With your performance today, I think you will win in Min Mountain Sword Sect in the future. Ding Ning thought for a moment. He looked at the flowing cultivators and said softly, if you really want to help me, do not let the details of today's battle spread. Qiu Zixing was not surprised. He had not expected Ding Ning to have so many deeper thoughts. He only thought that Ding Ning's method of condensing fiendish energy into a sword was astounding, but it was straightforward and lacked many variations compared to a flying sword. If he faced true experts, and this method was known beforehand, he would be at a disadvantage. I understand. Qiu Zixing nodded seriously and said, I will do my best. As Qiu Zixing and Ding Ning were talking softly, two youths in the carriage were also talking softly. These two youths were Fu Su and Meng Qihai. One was the imperial son of the Qin dynasty who would become crown prince next year if nothing unexpected happened, and the other was the heir of the Meng marquisate establishment. Regardless of which one of them died, the entire dynasty would be in great waves, much less both of them being assassinated here. At this time, Fu Su's face was slightly pale, and his breathing was unstable, but his eyes were full of praise and excitement. Meng Qihai's forehead was slightly damp with cold sweat. His face was even paler than Fu Su. Qihai, what do you think of Ding Ning right now? Thinking back to the many scenes of the battle just now, Fu Su smiled warmly as he looked at Meng Qihai, who was still in shock. Meng Qihai took a deep breath and said softly, I had not expected him to be so strong. Fu Su smiled and said, Then do you still feel unconvinced and feel that his pretentious attitude is annoying? His performance today is something even two of me cannot compare to. Of course, I am convinced. Meng Qihai lowered his head in shame, but then he immediately looked up and said, Why don't we go out and give our thanks now? Fu Su shook his head warmly and said, Another day is better. Meng Qihai was puzzled and asked, Why? If we go out now, there will be so many people. It will be troublesome. Fu Su looked at him and said softly, Also, the difference in status between us and him is too great. I do not want them to feel that we are too high above when we start to interact. Meng Qihai heard the deeper meaning in Fu Su's words. His eyes lit up. You mean we should conceal our identities and interact with them? Fu Su sighed softly and frowned. I do not know why something like this happened today. I do not know if something like this will cause Mother Empress and Father King to change their minds. But even if they allow me to attend the Min Mountain Sword trials, even if I do not want to, I fear that my whereabouts and identity will be hidden even more. Dressed in white robes, Yi Sealing sat in a carriage and waited. Theoretically, she was the Realm's 7 cultivator, who should have appeared near Falling Parasol. However, not far from the carriage she was in, there were layers upon layers of canopies that stretched endlessly. Surprisingly, it was the fish market. Fish market was open for business, but today it was even quieter and more deathly silent than the days of the New Year. Many of the shops were still open, but it was not just the people. Even the ghosts seemed to have disappeared. The originally narrow and crowded dirt path seemed to have become a little more spacious. A person dressed in a white fox fur robe, with a handsome appearance like a young master of a wealthy family, strolled through the alleys of Fish Market. With him as the center, there seemed to be countless whispers that sounded like ghosts. However, as he moved forward, these voices quickly disappeared in fear. He did not go too deep. After 100 steps, he seemed to be tired of the same scenery. He stopped and said with slight disdain, I do not know if these canopies are used to hide the ghost energy or to hide the presence of Realm 7. But do I really have to tear them down before you are willing to come out? Mr. Bai, you are a true dragon of the river. This is just a small quagmire. I do not know what has angered Mr. Bai. Mr. Bai is not riding the waves in the river, but tearing down this quagmire that can barely fit you. An old voice sounded in the darkness. A stooped old man, holding a black bamboo staff, slowly walked out of the shadows of a narrow alley. This should not be something you are asking me, but something I should be asking you. Bai Shanshui looked at the black bamboo staff in the stooped old man's hand. In his perception, there were many black bamboos swaying in the surroundings. His jade-like face showed great disdain. I have come to Chongling more than a dozen times, but have never entered fish market before. The reason is because we all have our own paths and do not cross each other's paths. However, you've gone too far. He paused slightly and looked coldly at the hunchbacked old man. While Fan Zhui treated me like the sect master, he was my senior sect brother. It is one thing for you to kill my senior sect brother, but you stole something from my Cloudwater Palace. Do you really think I am dead? The stooped old man's expression froze slightly. He said solemnly, Mr. Bai, you must have misunderstood. Apologies. Bai Shanshui looked at the old man and said. The stooped old man stilled and did not understand his meaning. A person like Bai Shanshui, who could summon the clouds and reign like a dragon king, was no small matter. He would not feel that something was wrong because of his words. Apologies. Bai Shanshui repeated. Then he looked coolly at him and said, If I have misunderstood, why don't you tell me of all the cultivation sects and places in Chongling, other than the master of fish market? Who else in Chongling knows the secret arts of the Qi Ghost Bamboo sect, and which cultivator who knows this secret art has reached Realm 7? The stooped old man completely understood his meaning. I do not know who else in Chongling is like this. In reality, if we knew that Chongling suddenly had a cultivator like this, we would be shocked ourselves. The stooped old man looked up at Bai Shanshui and said seriously, But we do not know that your senior sect brother was killed by someone, much less that he died at the hands of a Realm 7 cultivator, who cultivates the ghost bambooing secret art. We really did not do this. Bai Shanshui shook his head and said, I did not come here today to listen to such powerless explanations. If you can say that there is such a cultivator in Chongling, I may believe you. Pity, there is no other place in Chongling that has such a cultivator. After a pause, he said with slight disdain, Only the former Shang family in Chongling is the traitorous disciple of the Qi dynasty's ghost bamboo sect. The stooped old man suddenly grew angry and said harshly, Bai Shanshui, do not be too presumptuous. I respect you as an outstanding person. Do you really think that fish market is afraid of you? You are from the Qin, I am from the Wei. We are enemies to begin with. You respect me because you fear my strength. As to me, the destruction of the Wei is related to the Shang family. If not for the Shang family's reform that allowed the Qin dynasty to prosper, how could you have the power to destroy 3 dynasties? So I do not have as good of an impression of the Shang family as you imagine. Bai Shanshui smiled coldly and then shook his head at the stooped old man. He said, You are not a match for me. You are too old. You cannot even take one blow from me. Chapter 158. Those above Realm 7 were great grandmasters. Which one of them was not a true talent? The hunchbacked old man's black bamboo staff started to sway slightly. Even though he knew that Bai Shanshui's words were likely to be true, he still did not want to lower his head. But at this time, his hand suddenly relaxed. He took a deep breath and forced his anger to calm. The innocent will know they are innocent. Mr. Bai prioritizes the Wei people. Even if you have doubts, why rush? A weak but exceptionally calm female voice sounded. You forced me out. What explanation do you want me to give you? Bai Shanshui slowly turned his head and looked at the red-robed woman holding a black cithar who walked out from behind the hunchbacked old man. He sneered disdainfully. You dare to say that the innocent will know they are innocent. You dare to say that the people of Fish Market do not want my lonely mountain sword hoard and have not tried to investigate my whereabouts? The red-robed woman looked calmly at Bai Shui and said, Mr. Bai has the lonely mountain sword hoard and naturally understands that a man's wealth is his own ruin. Also, you said before that we are Qin and you are Wei. We are natural enemies. But if we kill you, we kill you. If we do not kill you, we do not kill you. The matter of killing your senior sect brother has nothing to do with fish market. Bai Shui's eyebrows rose. The red-robed woman said softly, I have said all I want to say. Even if Mr. Bai does not believe me, you must know that if we really fight for our lives here, even if this place is close to the Wei River, I think Mr. will not be able to escape unscathed. Bai Shui's eyebrows continued to rise. His long eyebrows gave off indescribable pride, like two small swords. Whether you believe me or not, whether you can or can't, you have to try to know. He shook his head and looked at the red-robed woman. Will a person like me come to fish market for nothing? If other people called themselves a person like me, people would feel they were arrogant and ignorant. But when Bai Shui said this, it was natural. The hunchbacked old man suddenly became alert. But Bai Shui's right hand had flicked 3 times. 3 drops of water floated towards the hunchbacked old man. When they reached him, they magically turned into 3 transparent bubbles and wrapped around the old man's body. The woman in red seemed to have sensed something. She frowned slightly and reached out to play the zither. The strings of the zither vibrated. There was no sound, but countless black bamboos broke out of the ground. In an instant, the black bamboos were as dense as a forest covering the sky and the sun. They formed a small world, covering all the yuan qi fluctuations in the area. Bai Shui walked forward slowly and confidently. Space and time seemed to have no boundaries before him. He arrived before the red-robed woman with a single step and reached out to strike her forehead. The red-robed woman raised her hand and clapped her palms together. Bai Shui had already retreated to her original spot. Countless wisps of black qi flowed in front of the red-robed woman. Her body shook slightly, and she took a step back. At the same time, the hunchbacked old man was so angry that his hair stood on end. Endless black gas surged out from under his feet, making the place where he stood not look like the ground, but like a passage to an endless demonic realm. He extended the black bamboo cane in his hand and knocked it forward. However, what surprised him was that the 3 transparent water bubbles surrounding him were not as strong as he had imagined. With a strike of his black bamboo cane, the 3 transparent water bubbles suddenly collapsed. His attack seemed to have hit empty air. With all his power, he felt indescribably sad. Bai Shui stood with his hands behind his back and looked silently at the countless black bamboos. The red-robed woman stepped in front of the hunchbacked old man. She pressed her hands on the zither and waited for Bai Shui to speak. However, at this moment, in the indescribably quiet black bamboo forest, a metallic voice rang out. Someone is waiting for you on the river surface. Bai Shui frowned. His body did not move, but a sharp sword essence broke out of his body. A transparent, watery light flew through the air and directly cut open a gap in the black bamboo forest. The person who spoke from the hole was in his 50s. His short hair reached his ears, and he dressed like a businessman. He did not have a powerful presence, but his expression was unspeakably calm. Facing Bai Shui's gaze, he showed a hint of rebelliousness. Who is waiting for me on the river? Bai Shui narrowed his eyes and said slowly, with your weak cultivation, I can kill you at any time. So you better answer honestly. The short-haired man looked unconcernedly at Bai Shui. I am just a messenger. If Mr. Bai finds it interesting, then kill me. I want to see who dares to meet me on the river. Bai Shui did not speak. His body moved, and he flashed out from the side of the short-haired man. In a moment, all of Fish Market was filled with white mist. A wave of white mist surged out from the side of Fish Market like a true dragon. The river was the river. Even if it was not stated, Bai Shan knew it had to be on the closest Wei River. The waves of the Wei River were great. In the winter, only 100 feet of the shore would freeze. While the snow had long melted, and even the floating ice was gone, the water was still bone-chillingly cold. There were not even many boats fishing on the river. When Bai Shan stepped onto the river, he was a true serpent. Waves rose naturally and supported his body. In that instant, he saw a figure standing on a reef that was only a few feet high in the middle of the river. This figure was not tall, half a head shorter than him. He was standing motionlessly, but in Bai Shanshui's eyes, he was indescribably proud. He himself was the most unruly, unrestrained, and arrogant person in the world, but every cultivator in the world knew that the Wei Cloud Water Palace's method was strong when it encountered water. Once Bai Shanshui stepped onto this river, he would be at his strongest. But this person met him where Bai Shanshui was at his strongest. This person was even prouder than Bai Shanshui. Bai Shanshui stood motionless, but the waves pushed him faster than any boat in the world. Soon, he was only a few dozen feet from the person standing on the reef. Bai Shanshui paused when he felt the burning aura rippling in the air like red charcoal. His lips moved slightly as he said, "Forth, Mr. Zhao?" In the next moment, he sneered. I was wondering who in the world could be so proud. Now, I think it is only the swords of the Zhao sword furnace. The handsome young person standing on the reef was much shorter than ordinary men. His expression was calm, but his gaze was unimaginably sharp. This was the strongest of the Zhao sword furnace. Zhao Si, hearing Bai Shanshui's words, Zhao Si said coolly, "You are very different from the rumored brute. You forced the eldest miss of the Shang family to fight at full power. I think you just want to test if she has just been through a fierce battle." Zhao 7 died in the streets of Chongling. Zhao Si and Zhao Yi appeared together in Chongling. Bai Shanshui looked scornfully at Zhao Si and said, "You did not meet me to praise me." Zhao Si did not disguise and said calmly, "Of course it is for the lonely mountain sword horde." Bai Shanshui smiled. His smile was unspeakably enchanting. Everyone in the world wants the lonely mountain sword horde. Zhao Si glanced at him and said, "I am not like them. Other than the lonely mountain sword horde, I want to see your sword. Even without the lonely mountain sword horde, I want to see your sword." Bai Shanshui put away his smile and did not speak. Zhao Si continued, "My master's sword was formed in the past, and he wanted to see all the swords in the world. Later, he fell into a trap. Before he died, his only regret was that he did not have a chance to fight that person. I am his most trusted disciple, and naturally have to fulfill his last wish. I have admired the Wei Cloud Water Palace's white mountain black water sword for a long time." Bai Shanshui said sarcastically, "It seems that the rumors are true. The people of the Zhao sword furnace are all crazy. Our paths are different in the end." Zhao Si looked at Bai Shanshui and said calmly, "All these years, your actions have always been with Wei as the leader. There is no hope of reviving the country, but you want to hold up a forest with your sword and shelter the remaining elders of the Wei dynasty. But the Zhao sword furnace is not like you. The Zhao sword furnace is just a place of pure cultivation. We have never had thoughts of serving a dynasty or a king. We only pursue the sword path of the Zhao sword furnace. We have a country in our hearts, but no king. Since the country does not exist, we only have enemies and the sword path we seek. In the eyes of many people, as great rebels, there were many possibilities of working together. But the true situation was that two tigers could not live on one mountain. Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si had not interacted for many years due to their different pursuits. Naturally, there was no regret that they had not met earlier. Also, no expert who was about to reach the peak would share the treasure in their hands with someone they had never met before. No one was willing to give up their high position to someone else, even if it was just a possibility, especially when facing someone like Zhao Si who could decide the future of the world. Everyone wants to complete what they want to do. Bai Shanshui looked at Zhao Si and said slowly, "Everyone wants the Lonely Mountain Sword Hoard, but the Lonely Mountain Sword Hoard ended up in my hands. So I am fated." Then he took a deep breath and said even more slowly, "I have wanted to see the strongest sword of the Zhao sword furnace for a long time." Chapter 159. Those above Realm 7 were grandmasters who controlled the world. True rebels had extraordinary presence. Most of the Realm 7 grandmasters in the world had never seen Bai Shanshui and the legendary fourth Mr. Zhao, but most knew they were not a match for Bai Shanshui and fourth Mr. Zhao. It was not a problem of cultivation methods and sword manuals. There was never a strongest sword manual, only stronger people. The Wei and Zhao dynasties had countless cultivation places. The reason only Bai Shanshui of Cloud Water Palace and fourth Mr. Zhao of the Zhao Sword Furnace were recognized as extraordinary existences was because they were the strongest people and possessed a spirit ordinary people could not imagine. When Bai Shanshui and fourth Mr. Zhao met, how could this be an ordinary battle between Realm Sevens? Hearing Bai Shanshui's slow words, fourth Mr. Zhao still stood with his hands behind his back. But the white clouds above the river suddenly turned red and turned into fiery clouds. Bai Shanshui expressionlessly reached out with his hand. The roaring river in front of him suddenly stopped flowing. Half of the river was cut off, not by a powerful force, but by a mountainous primal energies of the universe, forming a spinning pool in front of him. Countless water grasses at the bottom of the river were exposed to the sunlight. Countless fish and shrimps jumped in confusion and terror in the dehydrated sand, not knowing what had happened. Seeing half of the river turn into a jade pool and the bottom of the river turn into a plain, fourth Mr. Zhao had an expression of admiration. "My generation likes to learn the sword and spent 10 years in a cold pool." He first recited a line that Bai Shanshui had sung and fought in Changling. Then he looked at the jade pool that gave off astounding sword essence and praised, "It seems this is the life bond sword you spent 10 years to cultivate." Bai Shanshui did not answer. A thick green flame rose from the jade pool. A thick green longsword was pulled out of the pool and landed in his hand. After this sword was pulled out of the jade pool, the spinning pool in front of him seemed to lose its soul, turning to ordinary water and scattering into the dehydrated riverbed. The fish and shrimps felt the world around them being filled with the water they relied on to survive. They did not feel joy, but fled from this area in terror. The green color of the long sword was deeper and brighter than any gemstone, but the inside of the sword was black and white, vaguely resembling a white mountain and black water. Bai Shanshui held the sword and looked indifferently at Zhao Si. "My sword is already in my hand. Now let me see your sword." Zhao Si nodded, then looked up into the sky and said, "Then take this strike of mine." Bai Shanshui sensed something and looked up into the sky. High up in the sky, which no one could see with their eyes, the natural powers were getting thinner and thinner. At the height where the natural powers were so thin that they had almost completely disappeared, there were many magical light arcs, disordered star powers, the essence fire of the sun, and both extreme coldness and extreme heat. There was a small red sword floating inside, receiving the washing and tempering of the extreme cold and heat. It moved along a fixed path like a star, but there was a thought connected to Zhao Si. His thoughts were so great that even his life-bond sword flew in the sky, like a star. Not many people could understand what fourth Mr. Zhao meant by sacrificing himself to seek the path. In this moment, the small sword seemed to wake up. Before it accelerated, it gave off crimson flames and then started to fall at a terrifying speed. The crimson-red flames and the primal energies of the universe rubbed against each other, causing the flames to grow fiercer. In a fraction of a breath, the layer of true fire outside the sword became pure and colorless. Under the impact of the terrifying speed and the pressure of the surrounding primal energies of the universe, it turned into a layer of glass-like matter that stuck tightly to the sword. The fire outside the sword turned crimson and became more and more intense. When it really passed through the burning clouds on the river surface and appeared in Bai Shanshui's sight, it had already become a huge crimson fireball with a flame tail more than 10 miles long. Such a ball of fire could be seen from many high places in Changling, on a stargazing platform in the imperial palace of the Qin dynasty. A historian saw a shooting star like this in the day and paled. A falling star in the day, deep red in color. This is a demon star. Wild winds howled on the river surface. Fourth Mr. Zhao's sword was still dozens of feet away from the river surface. The river water under Bai Shanshui's feet had dried up layer by layer, turning into steam with terrifying heat. Bai Shanshui's eyes showed true shock. Seeing such a sword, he finally believed that the legend of the Grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace burning the lake with one sword in the war between the Qin and Zhao was true. This was a sword that contained the true fire of the star and the furnace of the world. But he did not think he would lose. This was a great river connected to the sea, and not a sealed lake. He took a deep breath. A unique wave of primal energies of the universe was released from his body and landed in the river water under his feet. He seemed to be one with the entire Wei River. He swung his sword at the ball of fire like a demon star. Vast blue waves surged from the surface of the river, and the terrifying qi of heaven and earth was summoned from afar. However, it did not travel in the air, but in the deep water. It was like a real dragon swimming in the water and finally converged into the dark green longsword in his hand. White mountains and black water came out of the sword like they were creating a unique world. The two colors of sword qi rapidly transformed in front of him. First, it formed a huge white coiling snake. It opened its huge mouth and bit at the falling fireball. Then, the black color behind the white color condensed into a huge black turtle. The energies of the white snake and black turtle resonated with the stars in the sky. The yin and yang changed, creating the Xuanwu essence that was both offensive and defensive. The moment the white coiled snake opened its mouth, a ball of cold blue sword energy flashed and immediately extinguished half of the deep red ball of fire. Zhao Ci's eyes started to give off heated light. The small sword in the center of the crimson fireball suddenly cut out countless paths in the air according to his will. In an instant, tens of thousands of glazed crystal light poured down. When the two collided, the cold, dark green sword light was immediately eliminated. A cracking sound was heard. The white snake caught his small sword in its mouth, but could not stop it at all. It exploded from the snake's head. Bai Shanshui exclaimed softly. Balls of black, fiendish energy rose like clouds. In a flash, all the water and fire disappeared. Only a thin ring of mist spread on the river surface. Bai Shanshui, holding the green sword, was in front of fourth Mr. Zhao. Bai Shanshui stabbed with his sword. The sword he stabbed at fourth Mr. Zhao did not have any dazzling light or shadow, but when this sword stabbed out, the waves on the river completely disappeared, and the great river instantly became deathly still. This was his most powerful sword strike. Not only did it contain his most powerful essence, energy, and spirit, It also contained the heavenly Tao of water. Fourth Mr. Zhao made a soft sound of surprise. But he only made a sound of surprise. The small sword with a layer of fire flowing on it landed in front of him. He gripped the small sword simply and stabbed it by Shanshui. There was a loud bang. Fourth Mr. Zhao's small sword and by Shanshui's green sword collided and gave off endless flows of heat. Fourth Mr. Zhao's expression was cold. He seemed to be in the smithy of the past. Facing the flow of the river, all the fires in the smithy seemed to be extinguished. Yet a scene from the past appeared in his mind. In the pouring rain, a weathered and unruly man held a red-hot hammer and swung it down, creating sparks. In the next moment, he put the red-hot hammer and the sword he had just struck into the water under the eaves. There was a hiss. The red hammer and sword turned black and cold. At this time, a sound sounded in front of Fourth Mr. Zhao. The heat of the small sword in his hand disappeared, turning into black and cold metal as it continued to move forward. The green longsword in by Shanshui's hand suddenly shook, and his entire body flew backwards. His feet never left the surface of the water. As his figure floated up, a huge wave suddenly swept up behind him on the surface of the river. Fourth Mr. Zhao's figure did not move. The small sword in his hand recovered its red color and slowly lowered. His clothing was disheveled, and countless strands of hair flew behind his head. To everyone's shock, he revealed his female appearance. What was even more shocking was by Shanshui. Countless ripping sounds came from his body. His white fox fur coat split open, revealing a snow-white area on his chest. There was actually a deep ravine. As his figure took several steps back, the tattered fox fur coat scattered. His figure was graceful, and he did not have his usual manliness. He was clearly a tall and beautiful woman. Fourth Mr. Zhao's expression did not change. He looked at Bai Shanshui and said, "So the strongest rebel in the world, Bai Shanshui, is a woman." Bai Shanshui's presence was disordered, and he revealed his true appearance. His face was covered in frost. He said, "Are you not the same?" Fourth Mr. Zhao looked coolly at him and said, "The Zhao have many widows and women. The men of the Zhao had mostly died before the Zhao were destroyed. It is normal that most of the remaining are women." Bai Shanshui took a breath. While he did not use vital energy to control his body and return to his female appearance, he was still heroic and had an indescribable charm. Her expression calmed, and she looked coldly at Fourth Mr. Zhao. She said, "It seems that I can only call you Fourth Miss Zhao in the future." Fourth Mr. Zhao retorted, "Before entering the sect, I was called Zhao Miao, but I do not know Miss Bai's name. Bai Shanshui only means white mountain and black water and is not your true name." Bai Shanshui's eyes immediately showed hints of embarrassment, but she still gritted her teeth and said, "I am Bai Lu." Fourth Mr. Zhao said calmly, "Bai Lu is Frost, a good name." Bai Shanshui sneered, "While you won by half a move, it is impossible to keep me here. Do you think you can humiliate me with words?" Fourth Mr. Zhao shook his head and said calmly, "I am just surprised." After saying this, she looked at the distant Chongling and slowly said, "Chongling is the place that nurtures true dragons. The strongest cultivators in the world all come from Chongling. Is this true? It seems that you have had some fortuitous encounters in these days in Chongling. Otherwise, I think I would not have just won by half a move." Bai Shanshui's lips trembled. She knew Fourth Mr. Zhao spoke the truth. The river water surged along with her emotions. At this moment, there was an additional white and graceful figure on the surface of the river. Chapter 160. There was more than one woman in Chongling who could walk on the waves as though they were flat ground, but only one of them liked to wear white. There were rumors that she was doing this to worship that person. She was using the gray-black color of Chongling to express dissatisfaction. So she had been exiled overseas. Yet she had returned from the storm and killed Zhao Zhan with one blow. She was naturally the bureau chief of the astrology bureau, Yi Siling. In a few breaths, she was on the water near Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si. Originally, it was a gathering of heroes, but now it has become a show between three women. Yi Siling looked disdainfully at Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si. He said, "The two most famous heroes in the world are both women. If the news spreads, those arrogant men should find a piece of tofu to kill themselves." Bai Shanshui glanced at Yi Siling. At this time, her clothing was disheveled, but she had recovered her calm and her usual arrogance. "You are also here. It seems you started the matter of killing my senior sect brother and luring me into fish market," she said with a cold smile. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Yi Siling glanced casually at her and said, "You and I are enemies. Why do I have to give you an explanation? Why do you have to be troubled by such a problem?" Zhao Si said coolly, "We are all people in the game. There is no need to distinguish between us. If this is a trap set by her, she is not the only one here. She is just borrowing the sword to kill. But what is laughable is that the Yuanwu Emperor is realmate. There are so many Realm 7 cultivators in Chongling, so many marquises, generals, and ministers, but only one woman dares to come here and fight to the death with us." Bai Shanshui thought for a moment, straightened her clothing, and sneered. "It is to deal with the Deer Mountain Conference. They do not dare to be injured." Yi Siling looked at Zhao Si and smiled, showing two faint dimples. "Fourth, Mr. Zhao, you two have expended a lot of energy. Neither of you is a match for me right now. Why don't we work together and kill Bai Shanshui? You take the Lonely Mountain Sword Horde, and I take her for the reward. This is fair. We have stayed long enough." Zhao Si turned to look at Bai Shanshui and said, "What do you think?" Bai Shanshui sneered and said, "Even if we join hands to kill her, we will definitely be injured and fall into someone else's trap. At that time, out of the four most wonderful women in the world, 3 will die in an instant, and only Zheng Xiu will be left. She will be very happy at that time. Anyone who talked about themselves, especially when praising others, would feel strange. However, when she talked about it, it always made people feel that it was natural." Zhao Si smiled faintly and said, "You say that the most exciting in the world right now are the 4 women. I can agree with this number, but you say there is Zheng Xiu among them. Her cultivation is high, but she relied on schemes and the power of men to sit in the middle palace. How is she exciting? Speaking of the 4, the eldest miss of the Gongsun family and the eldest miss of the Shang family are stronger than her in my eyes." Yi Siling frowned and pouted like an innocent young girl. He said mockingly, "In the world of cultivators, women are not as good as men. This is a fact. The number of Realm 7 female cultivators in the world can be counted on one hand. They are not as good as men. You two find it interesting to boast about yourselves here? You are the same as us, but you insist on staying in Chongling to be a sword in someone's hand." Zhao Si was the shortest of the 3, but her gaze was the sharpest. She swept a glance and seemed to see through Yi Siling. She said coldly, "You are putting yourself in danger. What are you scheming? As a chess piece, can you flip out of the hands of the one who placed the piece? Also, in Chongling, there is more than one person who can place a piece above you." Bai Shanshui laughed as though no one was around. Maybe she also wants to be the empress? Yi Siling was not angry. 2 small dimples appeared on his cheeks again. "I want to. If I succeed, I have to thank you for your auspicious words." Yi Siling usually roared in the mountains and forests with her sword. If she did not feel like it, she would strike with her sword. She was more arrogant than most men, but in terms of bickering, she was not a match for Yi Sealing. Hearing Yi Sealing's response, she grew angry and narrowed her eyes again. Zhao Si looked coolly at Yi Sealing and said, "I see that you have not given up. I heard that the 9-death silkworm has appeared. So you have returned from overseas?" Yi Sealing frowned and said, "You do not need to test me with words, and do not need to act like you are thinking for me. Zhao Zhan died at my hands. I think that if we meet, one of us will die." Zhao Si's expression did not change. She said coolly, "I think that the person who set up this situation today also feels that I will kill you. The people of the Zhao Sword Furnace cultivate the Sword of Death. But this person did not expect that my path is not here. So many people of the Zhao Sword Furnace have died. So many people have died just to complete Teacher's path. Teacher's path is the path I will walk today." After a pause, Zhao Si slowly raised the small sword in her hand and said coolly, "Since you have come today, you will act it out to the end. Let me experience your one sky water first." Yi Sealing did not speak and looked up into the sky. There seemed to be a mountain flying in the sky. A glowing water droplet appeared in her hand and then turned into a sword. In the previous battle with Bai Shui, Zhao Si had always been the last to move. Even when Bai Shui was at her strongest, she had still won and wounded Bai Shui. But now, she was the first to move. The power in her body suddenly exploded, flooding into the small sword in her hand and gathering at the tip of the small sword. Her body was like an enormous furnace, and the tip of the small sword seemed to give birth to a crimson star. Yi Sealing stabbed with his sword. The sword in her hand suddenly disappeared when she stabbed. Her sword had never existed before, but now it had disappeared. An extremely soft power wrapped around the small crimson sword in Zhao Si's hand, causing this small sword that seemed to carry a star forward to be unable to move forward. Zhao Si frowned slightly. So Bureau Chief Ye's strongest skill is not the storm, but the method of using soft to subdue hard. She shook her head and spoke. Then she released her hand. In the battle with Bai Shui, she had lost much of her energy, and her killing intent had disappeared. Since she could not defeat Yi Sealing's attack and could not advance, she retreated. She released her hand. The small crimson sword shook, retreated, and flew into the sky. In the blink of an eye, the small sword had already flown into the endless sky towards where it came from. Her figure, like a real flying sword, broke through the air and flew backwards. As Zhao Si retreated, Bai Shui threw the thick green long sword in her hand down. This simple toss caused Bai Shui to cough up a mouthful of blood. The water in the river immediately disappeared. But unlike before, the fish and shrimps had fled far away. Only the aquatic plants at the bottom of the river lay weakly in the slightly damp sand. The thick green longsword disappeared, and an enormous spinning pool immediately covered Yi Sealing. Yi Sealing gave a long howl. Her body was like a heavy rock that had landed at the bottom of the pool. She released waves of vital energy. With a great boom, a torrential rain started to pour from the river. But these raindrops did not fall from the sky, but from the depths of the river towards the sky. The glowing water droplets that formed around her cut into the spinning pool, turning into more water that sprayed into the sky. In a flash, the glowing water droplets formed thousands of small glowing swords that formed a sword formation. Yi Sealing took a deep breath and gave another howl. A mouthful of bright red blood dripped down from the corner of her tightly pressed lips. The thousands of small glowing swords stabbed out together into the pool. The pool was like a serpent pinned by thousands of small swords, unable to summon wind and rain. In the next moment, it turned into countless streams of water that charged towards the bottom of the river. Poof! like a giant dragon spitting out a pearl, Yi Sealing was charged out of the river by a powerful wave of energy. As she started to fall from the sky, the river closed, the waves surged, and Bai Shanshui was nowhere to be seen. Drops of blood bloomed on her white robes like red plum blossoms. In the muddy river water, a faint stream of blood spread, like a wounded serpent leaving behind a trail. Yi Sealing coughed softly. It was not clear whether her dim eyes were filled with regret or joy. At this time, deep in the imperial palace of the Qin dynasty, in a square copper palace, the Yuanwu emperor, the strongest emperor in the history of the Qin dynasty, slowly raised his head. He was dressed in casual robes, his hair uncombed, and his appearance unkempt. Above Realm 8, there were wonders that Realm 7 could not imagine. There seemed to be countless stars flowing in his eyes. Zhao Ci's sword was like a falling demon star. It was too powerful. As it flew back into the sky like it was returning to its scabbard, he caught its trajectory. He took a deep breath and raised his hands slightly. He could not help but want to attack, but other people could not sense it. For a cultivator of his cultivation, this was a long hesitation. His hands hung down, and his fingers flicked slightly. In the Empress study, the patio above the spirit springs suddenly shot out countless pure rays of light. The rays of light crisscrossed. The points of intersection became brighter, like countless small stars floating above the multiple lotuses in the spirit spring. A hint of coldness flowed across the Empress' flawless face. She raised her left hand, and numerous pure rays of light shot out of her fingertips. In the sky, the crimson-red sword was about to return to its fixed trajectory and float down. But at this time, in the cold space above, starlight like the tail of a comet surged out. They turned into pale, white pillars of fire without any warmth and swept onto the crimson-red sword. Zhao Ci had landed on a mountain peak. Her eyes were filled with shock and anger. With a pop, she vomited a mouthful of blood. She could not control her body and fell to the ground. In the sky, the light in the seal scripts of the crimson-red sword was extinguished. It was scorched black, turning into a piece of rusted iron and falling to an unknown place. Chapter 161. The Life Bond Sword was an item that cultivated both life and life. Especially for a life bond sword like 4th Mr. Zhao Miao's, the sword embryo was not an ordinary item. Who knew how many years of hard work she had spent to cultivate to her current state? Today it was destroyed. Her energy, Ci, and mental power were both heavily injured. Naturally, she was extremely shocked and angry. While you destroyed my life bond sword, you cannot kill me today. I have seen a threat of Realm 8. It will be harder to kill me in the future. Yet this fury immediately turned into a kind of tenacity and sharpness in her eyes. This kind of adversity seemed to stimulate her desire to pursue the sword path of the sword furnace. Why is it like this? At this time, a furious young man with thick brows appeared on the peak. It was Zhao Yi, Bazin Kendo Ground's Starfire Comet tail sword. The one who attacked was Zheng Xiu. Zhao Miao coughed out a mouthful of strange pink blood and sneered. She just borrowed some of the Yuanwu Emperor's power. Today, she made me suffer a blow. In the future, I will pay her back. Zhao Yi took a deep breath and nodded. This was natural for him, who also came from the sword furnace. But at this time, Zhao Miao's gaze flashed violently. She said coldly, "Go find Bai Shanshui." Zhao Yi stilled. In his view, while Bai Shanshui had been greatly wounded in battle, he may not be a match for her at this time. Also, when Bai Shanshui entered the Wei River, she was a true serpent entering the estuary. He could not find Bai Shanshui. Also, Zhao Miao was seriously injured. This place was extremely dangerous. The most important thing was to immediately escort her away. Bai Shanshui will not go far. I am not telling you to chase after her. Zhao Miao glanced at him, her expression growing colder. Today, this is a grand scheme. The person who set up this grand scheme will not let us leave easily. My life bond sword is destroyed. For those people in Changling, I am not as important as Bai Shanshui, who carries the secrets of the Lonely Mountain Sword Hoard. Even if I cannot take the Lonely Mountain Sword Hoard, I will not let it fall into the hands of the person who set this up. Zhao Yi glanced at her, his expression still hesitant. Zhao Miao looked down, her face filled with indescribable murderousness. While I am seriously injured, it will not be so easy for these people from Changling to kill me. Zhao Yi was stunned. He sensed an indescribable presence coming from Zhao Miao. This presence, in his memories, seemed to have appeared on the teacher everyone in the Zhao sword furnace respected greatly. Be careful. He didn't say anything else. He took a deep breath and nodded. When Zhao Yi and Bai Shanshui disappeared, Yi Xiling felt tired. She sat down on the rock where Mr. Zhao Miao had been standing. Then she sensed a subtle change in qi activity in the direction of the imperial city. Then she sensed a violent fluctuation in the endless sky. She knew more about the Yuanwu Emperor and Zheng Xiu than almost all the cultivators in the world. In the past, when the Qin had destroyed the 3 dynasties, she had seen Zheng Xiu's starfire comet tail sword sweep down from the sky like a true comet tail more than once. Zheng Xiu's sword essence, where the sword and star became one, was similar to Zhao Miao's sword essence that had been tempered by starfire and turned into a meteor. While it was not as direct and sharp as Zhao Miao's sword essence, Zheng Xiu's life bond sword was hidden somewhere in the stars. It was only the sword that broke the starfire. But Zheng Xiu's cultivation was slightly higher than Zhao Miao's, and clearly she had received help from the Yuanwu Emperor. She could imagine the outcome of Zhao Miao's life bond sword. For the greatest rebel of the Qin dynasty, Mr. Zhao Miao's life bond sword being destroyed was like cutting off an arm of Mr. Zhao Miao's. Just from this, the person who set this trap today was very generous. But would it stop here? Was the one who set this trap today the Yuanwu Emperor, the Empress, the 2 ministers, or someone else? Of the 3 people caught in this trap, only she knew who had killed Fan Zhua. Only she knew that while she had Han Sancher conceal the presence of the 9 Hell King sword that day, the presence that had led Bai Shanshui to Fish Market had not been her handiwork. Other than the former Shang family, who else in the court was a powerful cultivator of the Qi Ghost Bamboo sect? To be able to set up such a trap there, they should know that she had concealed the matter of Fan Zhua and the 9 Hell King sword. Then what would they do to her next? Women are often stubborn. Thinking of Zhao Miao's words, and how he still chose to stay in Changling, Yi Xiling smiled self-deprecatingly and said to himself, in the middle of the river, Bai Shanshui stood silently like a water immortal moving with the flow. Using some kind of secret art, her breathing did not seem to be obstructed in this flow of water. All the blood on her body had been washed clean. Her presence was as pure as the cleanest water, but her face was pale. She did not know much about the powerful secret arts of the Bazin Kendo ground, but when Zhao Miao's life bond sword was destroyed, she had sensed the powerful energy collision in the sky. She knew that only the few people in the Changling Imperial Palace could do such a thing. At this time, she realized that the one who set up this trap today was not as simple as a marquis. The secret arts of Cloud Water Palace could allow her to stay in the water for dozens of days and cause her presence to completely merge with the flow of water. Even if Emperor Yuanwu, a realmmate, came to the surface of the river, she was confident she would not be detected. Yet when 4th Mr. Zhao Miao's life bond sword was destroyed, she felt great unease. She felt that in this grand scheme, this was just the beginning. When this feeling of unease rose, she no longer hesitated. She took out a glass pill bottle from her sleeve, poured out the only blood-red pill inside, and put it into her mouth. A sickly blush appeared on her face. The water flow that wrapped around her didn't seem to be any different, but her figure within it was more than twice as fast, turning into a white flowing shadow. In less than the time it took to brew a cup of tea, the water she was in became deeper. In the dark water in front of her, a huge white shadow appeared and rapidly approached her. This was an enormous white carp, its eyes flashing with intelligence. This was a friend Bai Shan had made when she cultivated the sword in the water many years ago. Usually, she would be overjoyed to see this white carp, but the moment she saw this white carp, she suddenly realized where her great unease came from. No, she gave a shrill cry in the water. A string of air and sound waves exploded in front of her. In this moment, the enormous white shadow suddenly froze in the water. A circle of red light spread along its head, dyeing the world in front of Bai Shan, and her eyes red. My generation likes to learn the sword. 10 years in the cold pool. One day, I killed the serpent, the blue water crimson, for 3 months. Today, I will fight Chongling, and in the future, I will kill the Qin king? Ha ha, Bai Shan, you were arrogant in Chongling back then, but you did not expect that in the eyes of the emperor, you are just a stray dog. A wave of arrogant laughter caused the water to explode. A figure dressed in ordinary gray robes gripped one of the white carp's whiskers with one hand and pulled the white carp's head into his hand. At the same time, a terrifying sword essence came from his right hand. The inky green sword light was like an enormous water plant that surged in front of Bai Shan. There was an explosion on the originally calm river surface, and a huge water column with a radius of over 100 feet appeared. Bai Shan was forced out of the water by this sword. Lian Bo. Bai Shan was furious. With a shout, she gripped the green sword in her hand. That gray figure had floated to the surface of the water. This was a middle-aged man holding an inky green sword. He was dressed in the most ordinary gray robes of Chongling. His features were ordinary, but there was a straight sword mark and the brand of a prisoner on his forehead. He looked shocking to the eye. At this time, this man casually threw away the white carp's head. He looked at Bai Shan and said emotionally, "After 19 years, we finally meet again." Bai Shan laughed in anger. "As a person of Wei, you have become a marquis of the Qin dynasty. You have enjoyed all the glory and wealth. You still remember your past grudges and the enmity of your sect. This powerful cultivator with the straight sword mark and the brand of a prisoner could only be Marquis Lian of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. While he had land and a marquis establishment in Chongling, he usually guarded the Xionqiang region. He had great power among the vassal countries in that region and was called half the king of Chong. Now, he had been secretly moved to Chongling and appeared in front of Bai Shan. Also, from Bai Shan's words, Marquis Lian was a person of Wei. Lian Bo touched the scar on his forehead and smiled, but his smile was slightly bleak. If not for the fact that your cloud water palace was so powerful in the past, and the sects that disagreed with you were eradicated, the Wei would not have been unable to recover. Even if it could not escape the fate of destruction, it would not have been destroyed so quickly. If we really want to argue, it is not about who is the true culprit behind the destruction of the Wei. Now, the Wei has been destroyed for so many years, but you are still focused on serving the country. Think about it. Because of your existence, the Qin always had a bad attitude towards the Wei people. You want the Wei people to have good lives, but you do not know that those people have bad lives because of people like you. Bai Shan sneered in disdain. After being a dog for so many years, you really think like a dog. Lian Bo narrowed his eyes and smiled. He said, "The king of Wei's bones are probably rotten by now. There is no meaning in saying this. I only remember that when my sect was destroyed, my teachers and senior brothers all died under your sword." Bai Shanshui did not look at him. He looked coldly at the sword in his hand and the blood of the white carp spreading in the water. He said, "Your family in the past has all died, but now you have more family in the Marquis establishment than before." Lien Bo understood the meaning of Bai Shanshui's words. He took a deep breath and said seriously, "So even if I die today, I will have you die here." You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.